So good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Center for Market Education, I'm very pleased and honored to host this event, Teaching Economics in the 21st Century, which in a while we will have the chance to listen to Professor Peter Boettke from George Mason University in Virginia, United States. I'm pretty excited to have him because just to give you a little bit of history, actually when I launched the idea to start the initiative called Center for Market Education, which is hosting this event tonight, I sent him an email telling him that I wanted to do something in Malaysia that was inspired by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And I still remember his reply, look for a couple of friends so you will be in three and you can do something. And that's how we started the Center for Market Education. So probably, I'm not sure if you remember this detail, Pete, but you are responsible for this birth. And you are then more than welcome to be here in this event. You can be updated on our initiatives by following our website, marketedu.org, and by following our Facebook page and our Twitter account. Then you have all the updates. And we will post on Twitter, on our website, and on our Facebook page also the recording of this event. But to host this event is also a very special occasion for the center because the event is co-hosted with Taylor University. Is our first initiative done together, and I hope will be the first of a long series. Taylor's University is the first private university in Malaysia with a specific school for liberal arts and sciences. So it's an honor for us to have the chance to have this event organized together with such an important educational initiative. So before introducing Professor Boettke, I would give the word to Professor Neethiahnanthan Ragavan, Executive Dean of the Faculty of Social Science and Leisure Management at Taylor's University in Malaysia, for some introductory remarks. Professor Neethia, to you.
Thank you. Thank you to Dr. Carmelo. Good evening and a very warm welcome to all our guests. Okay, I'm Neethia, Executive Dean and Professor for the Faculty of Social Sciences and Leisure Management, Taylor's University. It's my privilege to present these introductory remarks for today's webinar entitled Teaching Economics in the 21st Century by Professor Peter Boettke, a very well-known and renowned professor of economics and philosophy at George Mason University, United States of America. I'm also happy to note that this webinar is co-hosted by the Center for Market Education and the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Taylor's University. At this point, allow me to thank Dr. Carmelo Ferlito, Director for the Center of Market Education and Senior Fellow at the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, Malaysia, or better known as IDEAS, for his kind gesture to work on this project together with Taylor's University. Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps at this juncture, I could also share very good news that we have all received yesterday. Taylor's University is now ranked as the #1 private university in Malaysia and Southeast Asia by QS World University Ranking. We are truly happy and we would like to thank everyone for their trust and support. And surely this collaborative webinar between our two organizations is timely. The Center for Market Education is an academic and educational initiative supported by the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, or better known as IDEAS, an independent and not-for-profit think tank based in Kuala Lumpur. Its mission is to promote a better understanding of the driving forces of the market processes, and the importance of pluralism in economics education. The education mission of CME and Taylor's University binds us together as we join hands in this webinar to analyze and reflect upon contemporary economics and social issues of eminent significance. I guess this is the best time, as every other day we are confronted with news on economic impacts thanks to the coronavirus. As the leading private university in the country, Taylor's has been committed to a multi-perspective understanding of political, economic, social, and cultural issues within Malaysia and the world. I'm delighted to share that in 2021, the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences will launch another bachelor degree, which is in social sciences. And it will offer one of Asia's first specialization on social innovation and change, and another specialization on international relations. Towards this successful launch and growth of this social science degree, we look forward to our partnership with IDEAS, as well as other leading institutions in the country and the region. Ladies and gentlemen, the unprecedented magnitude of the decline in employment and production worldwide and its broad reach across the entire economy worldwide caused by this pandemic, and consequently the impending recessions predicted to be worse since the Great Depression and the Asian financial crisis, as a result of many constraints. The major one is the movement control order and closing of international borders. Worse still, in some cases, closing of domestic borders. This has warranted the governments of all over the world to implement stimulus packages with the hope to mitigate social and economic risks arising from this economic disruption. In this context, we are faced with an extreme dichotomy of balancing between public health and safety on one hand and economic crisis on the other hand. Which one do we choose? Which is the right and wrong decision? Communities losing their jobs, deprived of food on the table, or public health being impacted by this deadly virus? Are places and destinations opening up today because it is driven by economic conditions, or because we are now safe to travel around from this virus? Some experts have contended that economics is the queen of social sciences. Economics is the study of how people allocate scarce resources for production, distribution, and consumption, both individually and collectively. At a discipline, it studies human activities, its environment with scarce resources, and uses scientific method and empirical evidence to build its base of knowledge. Furthermore, economics provide distilled framework to analyze complex societal interaction between consumer and the firms. However, beyond complex mathematical analysis, economics does emerge as a key discipline that is most related to our everyday lives. It does not only involve policymakers, governments, and corporations, but it also involves a segment of society. In fact, every small decision that we make in our everyday life can be analyzed from a perspective of economics. Therefore, this webinar is timely, and we find ourselves on the brink of emerging out of the pandemic, I hope, and start reconstructing our lives, businesses, and the overall understanding of people, profit, and the planet. Today's webinar, Teaching Economics in the 21st Century, which focuses on teaching economics as a social and human science, is a timely paradigm shift for all of us in the application of economics given this new normal. Taylor's University is committed to its pursuit of educating the youth to take their productive place as global leaders of the future, and to explore diverse perspectives within this context of their academic discipline. Our reputed American degree transfer program at the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences create an environment of discovery, nourishment, and excellence through holistic education for its students. Deeply rooted in the American education philosophy, our students are encouraged to debate, and discuss multidisciplinary perspectives, and appreciate the value of civic responsibility and community engagement, which I believe is essential core values of the 21st century. This evening's webinar, presented by a very well-known professor, Professor Boettke, would serve as a key opener for all of us, as it would give us an insight into economics that excites the imagination to explore new knowledge and broaden their application of economic principles. Thank you once again to IDEAS and Dr. Carmelo from the Center for Market Education, our distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Boettke, and to the school's leadership team headed by Associate Professor Dr. Anandita Dasgupta and Associate Professor Dr. Guido Benny, the Program Director, for co-organizing this prestigious international webinar. To all our viewers, enjoy the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Neethia. Thank you for these very important remarks. And now is the moment for me to introduce you. I think that doesn't need really my introduction, but out of formality, let's introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Peter J. Boettke, Professor of Economics and Philosophy at George Mason University and Director of the FAI Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics and Economics, and BB&T Professor for the Study of Capitalism at Mercatus Center at George Mason University. A leading figure in the econ profession, but was probably known by many to be the most relevant economist in contemporary Austrian economics. I would say that for the people of my generation, probably Professor Boettke is what Israel Kirzner was for his generation, or what Hayek and Mises were for Israel Kirzner. So I have really to say that having the chance to introduce him, to speak with him in this event is a source of certain emotion and really probably one of the most important moments of my scholarly career. So I'm really deeply honored. And one thing that always impressed me about Professor Boettke is not only his huge production as an editor and as an author or co-author and co-editor, but also his passion for teaching economics. So in his life, doing research in economics has never been separated from the passion for teaching, for communicating. A passion that I discovered with the publication of Living Economics, a book that was published a few years back, but I think it remains one of the most important passages for the career of Professor Boettke as a teacher. And a topic that comes back with a lighter volume, but with a very significant title. And the content of this book will be discussed this evening, the 4 pillars of economics understanding. For Professor Boettke, the 4 pillars are truth and light, beauty and awe, hope and compassion. I think that it will not be so easy for economic students to find these words working together with economic science. And so it's great that someone in the environment is reviving these 4 pillars of the economic understanding and present them to us. And I don't want really to steal any more time to Professor Boettke. Only another book from his production that I want to introduce to the public is a very important book, probably one of the latest books published on the work and the life of Friedrich August von Hayek, one of the most relevant economists in the Austrian tradition, and probably the only one that won a Nobel Prize in 1974. So Peter, the word and the floor is yours. I will come back later for the Q&A.
Okay, well, first, thank you very much for that introduction. It is very gracious of you. It's a thrill for me to be here, and I want to congratulate Taylor University on that great achievement of achieving that ranking, and also to all the people who are working behind the scenes to make sure that that ranking takes place. It's as someone who's involved in academia, I understand how difficult that is and how everyone has to be on moving in the right direction. And also to you, Carmelo, and the issue of ideas and CME and how you're getting off to a great start. So let's call up my presentation and share the screen. So I need to share screen. Call that up. Hold on, let me. Now do this. Now share screen. There we go. Okay, now. Is that fine? I think that's right? I think I got, and everyone can hear me fine. Okay, so I was given the task of talking about teaching economics in the 21st century. In the introductory remarks, it was already stressed how extraordinary our current times are, and how that raises a sort of a premium on being able to apply ideas to get intelligence and collective action, I think is a crucial idea here. Part of what I would like to say in the context of the current world pandemic is that it's in our most extraordinary times that we need ordinary economics the most. And what's happened over the last decade, ever since the financial crisis, is that a lot of folks have criticized ordinary economics. And part of my enterprise is to recapture what I think are the basic lessons of economics so that we can apply them even in these most extreme periods of time to in effect address the question that was raised in the introduction about the trade-offs that are required between, say, a public health crisis and an economic crisis, and to see how it is that we negotiate those trade-offs in a democratic society. And to do those with intelligence rather than not. Now, one of my favorite economists, old economists, is a man named Frank Knight, and one of his last books is called Intelligence and Democratic Action. And, that's what we're all trying to get at here. So, all right, let's, so teaching economics in the 21st century. My main points are going to be that economics is a tool for the curious. So the first thing that teachers need to do is to tap into the natural curiosity of their students. And one of the on the blackboard of teaching, but to get them to look out the window, what the economist Robert Frank refers to as the economic naturalist. Try to get them, just like you would in some other fields like biology or whatever, to actually be fascinated by the world that exists outside the window. In economics, this forces us to think about the mystery of the mundane. The things that we take as given that are just part of our everyday life that actually are quite mysterious. Adam Smith, in the beginning of The Wealth of Nations, tells a story about the common woolen coat. And he asks his readers to think about how it is that a common woolen coat ends up on the back of the average day laborer. So you're not picking out a exotic product, you're picking out the most everyday product. So right now, I'm drinking a cup of coffee. Where did that coffee come from? How did it end up by being produced? What was the division of labor that's all involved? If I can get students to first and foremost be curious about the mystery of that mundane, I, as an economics teacher, have started on the right process, I think. So I think economics has to enlist the curiosity of our intended audience. The second thing is economics is a tool for the critical. So among our audience are going to be people that want to be critical thinkers, that want to sort of offer social criticism. If you think about the world today, again, we have a variety of different policy responses going on. In the United States, for example, we have a variety of social ills that need to be addressed. And the students that I teach are going to care about those social ills correctly. They should care about them. I'll mention this shortly, but there's, huge problems related to, unemployment, inequality, racial injustice, all of these kind of questions. And then there's a policy response. What role does economics play in being able to sort out and critically analyze what is the most effective mechanism? This is one of economics' best tools, which is the strict means-ends analysis, that economics treats ends as given and analyzes the effectiveness of chosen means to obtaining the given ends, rather than just debating between ends among people, that we talk about this relationship between means and ends. And this allows us to sort from the desirable, in quotes, to the feasible, to ultimately to the viable in our public policies. And that tool is important. So economics enlists the curious. Economics also provides tools for the critical. So it enlists the imagination of the curious and the critical facilities of our audience. And then finally, I think it's a tool in both of those for focusing our compassion. We care about the lives of the least advantaged among us. When we talk about development economics, for example, we're asking the question, how is it that you can lift those who are under dire conditions up from those dire conditions? When you talk about economic prosperity, you're talking about generalized economic prosperity. Economics was never a tool for the powerful and the wealthy. In fact, it was born in a systematic criticism of the powerful and the wealthy, which is in fact mercantilism. Mercantilism was a system of privileges. Economics was born out of a critique of that system of privileges. And so it's this ability of what institutions we may be able to find that allows us to produce productive specialization and peaceful social cooperation among the multitude of individuals that economics focuses our compassion on. And then finally, the primary justification of economics as a public discipline is in fact our role as teachers. Not as our role as scholars per se. This relates to something Carmelo mentioned before, but the key issue is that what we're trying to do as teachers is provide tools for the curious, tools for the critical, and focus their compassion so that understanding and informed participation in the democratic process of collective decision-making can in fact take place. And in order for us to do that in our job, we need to first be able to communicate to people the power of spontaneous order or invisible hand explanations. Spontaneous order sometimes gives a wrong impression that things just happen. And the critical phrase in spontaneous order, as Hayek summarized it, was of human action, but not of human design. And so you have to give agency. So for those of you who are involved in the social sciences a lot, you'll know that there's this grand debate that's been going on for centuries over whether or not we give primacy to agency or we give primacy to structure. All right. And, you can sort of see economists in the typical neoclassical model maybe put too much emphasis on agency, and sociologists in talking about social forces might be putting too much stuff on structure. The invisible hand sort of economics of Adam Smith blends agency and structure. And so it's this kind of interaction effect between agency and structure that economics properly done, I would argue, allows us to explore. And that's invisible hand theorizing. And using invisible hand theorizing, economists are able to explore not only the seen, but also the unseen. All right. And so by looking at not only the immediate consequences, but the often unattended remote consequences of any action, we're better able to understand and provide social criticism. And that's what our job is as economists in offering our science to our students for them to then apply in their own participation in the democratic action of a democratic process of collective action. Okay, so there's a lot that I have in there to unpack, and I don't have the time to go through all of this. So hopefully maybe in the Q&A, we'll be able to deal with that. But I want to raise this issue. This is an ad that was done during the time of the Beveridge Report, when the Beveridge Report first came out. So the Beveridge Report was a report on social problems that was done in England in the 1920s, 30s, and then 40s. It was published in 1940s. William Beveridge was the head of the LSE when Hayek was teaching there as well. And basically what you can see here, I don't know if everyone can see it, but the little guy with the sword is government, and government has to take on the 5 giants of social ills. That is want, ignorance, disease, squalor, idleness. And if you think about that and then put the introductory remarks in perspective, we're still dealing with all of these 5 major issues, right? Which is want is poverty, ignorance is education. How do we organize our education? Disease, public health, squalor, housing. How do we deal with housing? Idleness, unemployment. And so these are still the hard questions in economics and public policy. They were the hard questions then. They're the hard questions today. I don't have time to go into an elaborate reason of why Keynesian economics came to be dominant in economics, but what I'll suggest here is that one of the reasons is, if you take those 5 giants seriously, is that what Keynes was able to do was to take the greatest fear of capitalism, which is mass unemployment, and combine it with the greatest resentment of capitalism, which is the idle rich, and explain a mechanism by which the idle rich gave rise to the greatest fear and therefore in need of a reform of the system. And that was like lightning in a bottle intellectually at that time in the 1930s and 40s. And so that's part of the reason why the economics profession, as has been, Mark Blaug in his book Economic Theory in Retrospect says that there's never been a time in the history of economics that an entire profession switched its perspective in less than a decade. And so that to be a non-Keynesian economist in 1955 was to be an extremely rare bird because Keynes had this great success. But that's only one way to try to tackle those 5 giants. I want to suggest that there's another way, which goes all the way back to Adam Smith. And so if you read this a long quote, I'm not going to read the whole quote out, but for those of you, you can read this. Here's from The Wealth of Nations. And just note what Smith is saying about social problems. No society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the greater part of the members exist in misery, right? And so the point about economics has always been, how do you actually lift, that portions of the population up? How Smith himself was there's a famous passage in The Wealth of Nations in which he says that the difference between the street porter and the philosopher is only in the mind of the philosopher. So Smith was an analytical egalitarian. He was again against privilege. That's a key issue. That goes all the way up from Smith to Hayek. Hayek defines in the Constitution of Liberty, liberalism as the absence of privilege. So the privilege system is going to be overcome by a system that focuses not so much on status, but instead on contract. And this is, you know, coevolution of economic liberalism and political liberalism through the 19th century and into the 20th century. And now what's the meaning of that for us today? So here, for example, is Hayek. Carmelo, you mentioned my book on Hayek. Thank you very much. I was trying to do my own plug-in here as well. You know, what would Hayek say about these Smithian puzzles? All obstacles to the rise of some are in the long run obstacles to the rise of all. And they are no less harmful to the true interests of the multitude because they may gratify its momentary passions. Economics, as was mentioned in the introductory remarks again, you know, our current momentary passions are leading to things like a new rise of protectionism, new restrictions on travel and commerce. Economics teaches about the free mobility of labor and capital, the opening up of the borders, the ability, as it's basically feeds in the technical economics of it, feeds into the principle of cosmopolitan liberalism, in which we rise up and we have this vast interconnected economy. Go back to my earlier point about Adam Smith and the woolen coat. And if you go through and look at how he discusses the common woolen coat, the supply chain of that common woolen coat is international, it's vast, and it's anonymous largely, yet nevertheless coordinated through the price system to be able to deliver to people a common woolen coat. So liberalism is the absence of privilege. It follows a generality principle, which is basically leads to a politics that it should exhibit neither discrimination nor domination. Most of human history has been politics that has been governed by discrimination and domination, and liberalism agitates against that. Again, I don't have the long period of time here to go through this, but I would recommend if you look at the origins of liberalism in religious liberty, in constitutional government putting restrictions, if you look at it in terms of economic growth, what you're going to find out is that economics was an emancipation project, or liberalism is an emancipation project. And it's an emancipation project to free us from the dogma of the altar, from the subjugation by the crown, by the violence of the sword, and by the poverty of the plow. Right? And we're trying to overcome all of those things, and that is the liberal project. So note that the mercantilist system, which Adam Smith wrote against, was a system of privileges that, in many ways, corresponds to a large amount of the politically protected class in the world today, is modern mercantilism. So protectionism and all that stuff is important. All right, so what is it that economists are cared about from this Smithian tradition? It's what is the most effective way to both minimize human suffering and maximize human flourishing. And we have to do that exercise against the constraint of nature. We have to do it against the idea of the complexity of coordinating distant and disparate individuals who have different plans and purposes in their lives. We have to do it with people that we're not familiar with, right? So go back to Adam Smith's passages right before the butcher, the baker, and the brewer. He discusses the idea that scarce in our lifetime do we have the opportunity to make a few close personal friends, but we require for our very survival on the cooperation of a great multitude. So how is it that we're going to get them to be able to produce the coffee that I enjoy drinking, or the muffin that I enjoy eating, or whatnot? And again, you know, it's this issue of raising the welfare of the least advantaged. So we talk about scarcity and trade-offs, productive specialization, mutually beneficial exchange, and peace and prosperity. And it's important to stress that economics, again, as a science, was born in a critique of a privileged system of mercantilism. And that in the 20th century, Hayek and others such as Buchanan are refining that message. And it's the job of economists today to continue in this task of social understanding and social criticism. And that's what I'm trying to hope to contribute to in these presentations about teaching. So let me get to the teaching point then, and see if we can, if this can motivate some discussion. So the first thing about teaching economics is, and by the way, I should point out is that I was a college student that had no interest in economics when I showed up at college. That was not at all what I was doing. I was taking it as a required course for what I was going to major in. And I had a Saul on the road to Damascus kind of experience in economics, which is that I had a fantastic economics teacher. He introduced me to the logic of economics, and the scales fell from my eyes and I was able to see. So this truth in the light aspect of economics, I think, is extremely important for everyone to understand. Once you recognize that we live in a world of scarcity, and that scarcity requires that we make trade-offs, and that in order to make the trade-offs, we need to have tools that help us negotiate the trade-offs, and those tools are property, prices, and profit and loss. And that enables us, and you teach people what role those property, prices, and profit and loss play in the ability of individuals to associate the necessity of trade-offs that is they're compelled to make because they live in a world of scarcity. That is the beginning of being able to understand the truth in the light of economics. And so that's the first thing, is stressing that. So that's Econ 101, right? We live in a world of scarcity. Scarcity implies trade-offs. That means that we need to have property to provide us with incentives, prices to provide us with innovation, and profit and loss accounting to be able to get the feedback. So profits lure us, losses discipline us, and that's how we get innovation and dynamic change. So that's the first thing to teach, and we should never lose that sight. It's shocking to people when you first teach it that the optimal amount of anything isn't zero. They get, they get set back, they get annoyed sometimes, but the economist has to keep punching through and reaching them. The second thing is that we have to recognize the beauty and the awe of this. So a lot of times, so for the listeners out there, they should all look this up on Google. Not now, because you're supposed to be looking at a lecture, but shortly. Look up the physics, okay, and the pendulum and painting, okay? Now, what happens is you'll see is that it's a physics experiment, and they'll take a pendulum, right? So they drop a line down from a ceiling, and then that at the bottom of that line is going to be paint. And then what they do is they start the pendulum swinging, and then they get away from it. So they just started, it initiates, it starts swinging, and then it lets it paint its own picture. Now, if you watch this, it's amazing because it produces this beautiful pattern, gorgeous picture out of this. Another example of this that sometimes people use to discuss emergence is a school of fish. And if you just look at the way a school of fish organizes and whatnot, well, the economy is similar to this kind of pendulum or the school of fish. It's an emergent order. It's an interdependent, complex coordination. If a revolution happens in Chile, the price of copper in New York City changes. How did that happen? It's not like any one central director from on high called down to the people in New York and said, hey, raise the price of copper. It happens through this interconnected web of exchanges and people responding to local information, and that gets aggregated and communicated. And this is the role, again, that property prices and profit and loss play. And so this is the Hayek, for example, makes an argument in the counter-revolution of science that economics, that science is born either in the necessity or in a sense of awe and beauty. And he argues that it's oftentimes the sense of beauty and awe that invokes greater scientific discoveries than like the immediate sense of immediacy today, or expediency today. And so economics has this complex coordination that makes up the division of labor. That is a thing of beauty to see. And we as economists have a responsibility to communicate that beauty and awe to our students so that they can see it. Third, hope. Well, improvement is indeed possible. To say a situation is hopeless is to say it's ideal. The world is far from being ideal, therefore, there's always hope. Where does that hope come from? That hope comes from entrepreneurs who find better ways to deliver goods and services to people to satisfy their needs and desires. It comes from rearrangements of the rules of the game under which we interact with one another. This is through Ronald Coasian type bargains, which allow us to negotiate away our conflicts with each other and realize mutual gains from trade, or from Buchanan type constitutional rules, which judge the entire system that will allow us to realize mutually beneficial exchange and productive specialization. I would recommend very highly to the audience Deirdre McCloskey's trilogy on the Bourgeois Error. You know, the first thing to understand is what has happened in terms of, you know, the tremendous improvement of mankind due to modern economic growth. I'll talk about that in a second. But also what McCloskey talks about is like what triggered that tremendous growth. Remember that if you do any kind of study of economic history, you're going to see a hockey stick, right? So most of human history, we go along and then whoop, you know, just scoots up. And the question for economists is that inflection point. When did that change? What made that happen? What are the consequences of that? And that is this great hope that it's a change in the ideas, a change in the rules of the game, a change in the recognition of an opportunity that previously was not seen. That provides great hope to human beings. And economics provides us with a tool to understand this notion of hope. And then finally, economics, as I mentioned earlier, focuses our compassion. We don't care about feeling good. We care about doing good. We're not to try to sound good. We're actually to do good. And that means that we have to use the tools of economic criticism to analyze the effectiveness of chosen means to achieve given ends from the point of view of the advocate of the ends. Not from the point of view of my advocacy, but from the point of view of the advocates of the ends. This is why Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, is a tragic story. It's a tragic story because the high ideals of the British socialists that he was writing to in the 1930s, all right, and 1940s, the high ideals that they had would in fact be undermined by the policies that they were choosing. And that's what Hayek was warning them of. And so it's a warning. It's there's a book out right now. I'm going to hold up a book now too, by Jeffrey Hodgson. If people can see it, it's called Is Socialism Feasible? Jeffrey Hodgson is a man of the left. It's an extremely nuanced and important book to read because he takes the criticisms of the traditional models of socialism seriously and is trying to figure out how we can have an alternative, better world that doesn't succumb to the same kind of problems that socialism has in its various manifestations. This is also the theme of another book. I have these here because I'm working on a project on this, Carmelo, and since you all them up, but this is another book that I recommend to everyone by Don Lavoie called National Economic Planning, What Is Left. And in particular, the chapter on what is left in this is fantastic description. Don Lavoie is a brilliant economist and social thinker who unfortunately passed away too early. But he was my teacher, and I owe him everything, actually. So this issue about the welfare of the least advantaged, the great fact of human history and the liberation from crushing poverty, this is what economics teaches us. And that's what we are incumbent upon communicating to our students. My view is that if we do a good job of communicating that to our students, we will in fact have enlisted their curiosity. We will have in fact given them tools of critical reasoning, and we will in fact focus their compassion. And in doing so, we will improve the ability to have intelligence within democratic action. So that's the basic theme of the 4 pillars of economic understanding. It's a collection of my essays over the years that were written not for necessarily for fellow academics, but more for undergraduate students and interested lay people that the American Institute for Economics research has brought out. This is the head of that institute, Edward Stringham, as the head of that group now. I recommend going to their website. They got a lot of really cool information there. And now I will stop sharing, and hopefully we can have a conversation.
Thank you very much, Professor Boettke. It was an enlightening presentation, and I'm happy that you mentioned also issues that are very dear to me, like the importance of economic history. Actually, I started my career in economic history, and I'm very grateful that you also mentioned the importance of Don Lavoie as a scholar, who also had a big influence on me via Dave Prichitko. So indirectly, I knew him via Dave. So I think that it was really an enlightening presentation, and it really gave us some hints on how economics can be relevant, and how teaching economics can be perceived and experienced as a mission. I think is one of the biggest points that younger lecturer can take, a lesson that they can take from your activity as a professor. So now, without further hesitation, let's take a look at the questions, which are very articulated, as we can see here. Let's start with the first one, because I think it's quite relevant with also with the point of compassion that you raised. How could economics make sense to the people in the periphery? How could economics make sense to them? I think that is a point that you partially answered already, but maybe you can elaborate more on this.
So that's a great question. I think that in teaching economics, that the number one thing that economics professors need to do is recognize that they have to start where the students are, not where they are. So a lot of times in teaching, the incentives are all set up so that the professor wants to teach basically what they just learned. Right? So they're a PhD student teaching as a lecturer, or they're a recent PhD who just finished, or they're an advanced scholar who is engaged in research. and they go into the classroom of teaching principles of economics, and they try to teach it as a watered down PhD class. So they end up by spending all their time on the blackboard talking about, you know, price elasticity of demand, or, you know, whether or not you know, the technical aspects of the derivation of a demand curve. You know, is it a income effect, substitution effect, all that kind of stuff. Those are very important tools of economic reasoning, but they're not what you do to teach students about getting excited about the discipline. You get excited, then you want to learn the nuances of the details. And so what I think people should be teaching is they need to start by where the students are. That means that they need to pay attention to their audience, the professor. Remember that a conversation is twofold. This is one of the reasons, or the downfall a little bit from this medium, is that as opposed to in a classroom, I don't have a read of the room right now, right, at all, because you know, the only face I see is actually yours, Carmelo. So I don't even know how people are reacting to it or anything like that. I'm trying to communicate information. I'm imagining in my head, but I don't know if my points are you know, being you know, understood or in fact interpreted, you know, wrongly. So I would stress that economics, this is why history is important. Economics should start out the window. Economics should start with contemporary affairs. Economics should start with historical puzzles that people care about, right? Not esoteric puzzles, but like puzzles that people really, really are paying attention to at the moment. Remember that history ebbs and flows too. So for example, when I started my career, the Soviet Union still existed. When I was very beginning of my teaching, the Soviet Union was collapsing, but it was collapsing that everyone could see. So the students in the class knew that it was collapsing. So if I was teaching economics in 2009, 2010, I'd be talking about the global financial crisis, because that's where the kids have in their head, you know, what's going on. So if I was teaching today, I'd be talking about the pandemic, right? So you have to begin where they are, not where you are, and then start to go from there. And I think that's the first thing to start that discussion, is to make economics relevant, because it's relevant to your concerns. If you present economics as abstract answer to abstract questions, very few people are going to come back for a second lesson. The great economics teacher, Paul Hayne, used to have a lesson, and the lesson was, teach the first class in economics as if it will be the last class your students will ever take, and it will be the first of many that they do take. All right? But don't teach your first class of economics as if it's the first class of 10 classes that they're going to take in economics. And so you have to prepare them for all the next stuff that's coming on. Yeah. I hope that's a clear enough answer. Yeah.
Thank you, Pete. You mentioned Paul Hayne. I just remind to the audience that Paul Hayne is co-author together with Professor Boettke and Professor Priscitko of a wonderful introductory textbook to economics titled The Economics Way of Thinking, that I think reached the 14th edition now, if I'm not mistaken. There was an interesting question that I lost it, but it's connected with one of our future webinar, and was if how do you see the issue of environmentalism as a potential new pillar of economic understanding?
Am I unmuted? Yeah, I'm unmuted. Yes. So here's the thing. That wasn't supposed to happen. Sorry. The environment is a very interesting question, because it goes back to that means ends position. It's not that economists are anti-environment, or that they're for the destruction of the land or whatever, right? It's that economists are asking, how is it that there's signals that will lead to the efficient use of resources, and in fact the dealing with externalities and all those other kind of issues that are involved. And so one is to admit that there are serious questions having to do with the environment. That's the number one thing. So, you know, climate change is real, climate change is man-made, right? The question for the economists, I think, is to look at adaptations and adjustments in relationship to policy choices as well. So, you know, there's lots of different innovations that take place. One of the greatest ways that we have a, you know, an improvement in our environmental quality is by technological innovations, which allow us to produce more with less, basically, right? And so we don't have to have as much environmental degradation to be able to get the same kind of level of output or whatever. That's from technological innovations. We also have individuals adapting and changing. Again, climate change is real. It's a serious problem. The question is, what is the most effective mechanism for, in fact, shifting around? Whether or not, you know, there's a trade-off. This goes back to the original question, even with the pandemic, is that you can address a question with a one-size-fits-all approach and cause economic growth to plummet, okay? So if we just said to everyone, from now on, no one can leave their house, you have to be completely in an autarkic environment, you have to grow your own food, you have to do all these things like that, what do you think would happen in terms of the welfare and well-being of the least advantaged in the world, right? It would be devastating to them. And a similar kind of thing, like I have to admit, I was a little thrown for a loop because in the middle of the pandemic, in the beginning of it, it was also Earth Day. I don't know if you remember this, and our local news around here got all excited because they would show things like, oh, look, the water in Venice is clean again, you know, because there's no commercial activity. Or, you know, look, the skies, you know, they look so blue, the birds are chirping better. I mean, I love nature as much as anyone. I mean, my wife and I moved away from the DC area a little further out, you know, precisely because we like to get away from things some. But, it's a question of means and ends, and that's where that critical facility of economics comes in. And I think a lot of the policies that are adopted by people that care about the environment will actually have detrimental effects in the long run on the environment. And I don't want to be viewed as a environmental denier because I'm pointing out the value of certain alternative mechanisms to improve the environment. So I would really highly recommend for the listeners to look up the Political Economy Research Center out in Bozeman, Montana, and the work that they do on what's called free market environmentalism. But there's a variety of different people that I think have made valuable contributions to that kind of work. Also, let me mention the economist Matt Kahn. It's a K-A-H-N. He's working on a book right now on adaptability and how human populations adapt to various different shifts in the environment around them, and that those adaptations are huge sort of improvements. And that's really like Julian Simon, and that the greatest resource is the human imagination. And so I think if you combine those kind of ideas with a concern with property rights and using the tools of economics to, you know, marshal incentives and discover and utilize knowledge, you end up by getting, you know, on your way. But it's a tough problem, and no one should be denying the problem.
Thank you very much. Another question that maybe is a bit for specialists, but I think is quite intriguing, from Paolo Silvestri, is how much your view on economics converge with McCloskey's Humanomics. We are familiar with the recent book from Darren McCloskey called Humanomics, and the foundation. Yeah.
Yes, of course. You know, there's the term humanomics comes from Vernon Smith and others, and so you know, and McCloskey has in fact developed that. So Vernon Smith and Bart Wilson are the ones who sort of coined the term humanomics. I would view myself very much as part of the humanomics group, though I have a slight different emphasis, but it's still the case that I am someone who views economics as humanistic in its methods and humanitarian in its concerns, and puts human agent at the center of economic analysis. So yeah, so I'm in that Vernon Smith, you know, Deirdre McCloskey camp. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think this is very much related, this question, to really the issue, the technical issue of teaching, from Clyde Bregu, who is a lecturer at South Bend, Indiana. How do you start your first class in your introduction level classes, and what activities do you use to engage your students in the first day of the semester, but also over the semester?
So again, that changes with the context. So when I was a student, the reason why that economics enamored me, is because my professor on the very first day talked about the gas lines. So, you know, I'm dating myself, but I went to college in the late 70s. There was a gas shortage in the United States at the time, and the government was rationing gas. So you could only get a certain amount of gas at the pump. And so as a result, you had to wait on long lines to get it. And we all experienced it. And the very first lecture I ever had in economics was about that. So as a consequence of that, that really, turned me on to economics. And I think that we should start with those kind of contemporary affairs that relate to the students today. That's what I mean by the begin where they are. I think it's, look, what we have to do is we got to respect the people that we're teaching to. And as a result, that means we're trying to have a conversation with them. They're adults. Their attention is drawn to a variety of different things that we need to communicate. We have a point we're trying to get across to them, and we need to reach them by figuring it out. When we fail, it's not their problem, it's our problem as a communicator. And so we have to find those things that relate. When I was teaching, I often used, and now it would be terrible, by the way, because my touchstone to contemporary culture is much less than what it was when I was younger and I was closer to them in age, right? But so I used to use examples from TV shows all the time when I was first teaching, or from bad movies from that time that they had all seen, movies that people went to and saw. But now my movie references would be like, their grandparents had seen those movies, so they would, they'd be terrible references. So, I can't do that same kind of thing, but I still try to find ways to relate to them and touch, their interests. I think so. We always remember that we must begin where they are.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. A question from Maria Leandra Madi from Brazil, and she's a fellow companion in the path for a pluralism in economics education. She's very active with the World Economics Association.
Huh?
So she asked, how can we change the economics curriculum in order to blend human agency and context in an evolutionary perspective?
It's a fantastic question. I want to learn from her and the efforts that she's trying to do. I'm trying to do the same thing in terms of that. Now, relating to the last question, then relating to that, imagine that you and I and her sat down and we had a conversation about that. You and I would turn pretty quickly to hermeneutics and the philosophical, underpinnings of understanding the way we do human sciences, the difference between human sciences and natural sciences, and that even the natural sciences are practiced by humans, and so therefore they're more humanistic than even the natural scientists think, let alone economics. If we did that in a principles of economics class, the only people that would be relating are the three of us. having that conversation. So we can't do that. This is what I mean by beginning where they are as opposed to where we are. Because what fascinates us today, after we've studied economics, we've seen the problems with economics, we see how these philosophical alternatives may lead in different directions, what fascinates us is that conversation. I think what we always have to remember is, what did we think about when we were 18? Right? We were 18, 19 years old. What did we think about? What, what got us excited? Not what we're thinking about when we're, 28, 32, 35, 50, 60 now, right? So, that kind of thing. And so I share with her passion about wanting to bring these ideas into economics to actually have a more pluralistic conversation. My view about pluralism in economics is that pluralism is a byproduct, not a cause. So professors can have very strong opinions, but pluralism is the outcome of a professional conversation. But that just means that the way that we teach advanced economics should be that economists are engaged in a contested conversation. You had Roger Koppel on not that long ago in a webinar. And one of the crucial issues, I think, in Koppel's view is not to say that there are no experts, but there shouldn't be any monopoly expert. And the problem in modern economics is that the way economics has moved from a tool of social understanding and social criticism to a tool of social control has led to a basic cookie cutter approach to economics, which comes close to having an expert monopoly, right? You are trained to think as an economist in one way and one way only. And that's where the problem comes in. And pluralism offers us an idea of being able to think more broadly, to think philosophical economics, to think historical economics, to be more institutional economics. And so I support 100% the movement that she's involved with. And I think that we should have more of it. But I also think that in that conversation, I would like to see the kind of economics that I value appreciated a little bit more too in that conversation. And so I would like to be part of that contested conversation and whatnot. I guess the last thing I would say about teaching, and once, let's say that the pluralism movement took place, right? I guess that I think I would start the principles of economics class first with a applied out the window class. And the students that got interested in, I think the second class or second year classes should be the history of contending perspectives among economists. And that is how different economists have thought about looking out the window. So you don't just read Adam Smith on free trade, you also read Frederick List on nationalism and whatnot. And then you see the contesting debate that goes on. So you read all the way up through, and one of the ways to do that is the great books of economics. So you read Adam Smith, you read, John Stuart Mill, you read Karl Marx, you read Veblen, you read Keynes. But, in that thing, you should also be reading, I would argue, Mises and Hayek and Knight. And in modern times, you would be reading not just, Keynes and Milton Friedman, but you'd also be reading, Hayek and Buchanan and some other people. And, so one way I think of doing this is having people read the Nobel laureates. So I taught a course last semester, and what we did was we read not all of them, but many of the Nobel Prize lectures that related to so each week we would have a topic, and we'd start with the Nobel Prize lecture that was given in that topic, and then we would talk about the details of it and go from there. And I thought that was a very good exercise. But you'd have to ask the students whether or not they thought it was a good exercise, because again, it could be like the three of us talking about philosophical things. So yeah. I'm a big advocate of pluralism.
Yeah, let me spend a word on this, because indeed you mentioned that you'd like to see your perspective more appreciated or more involved in the pluralist movement. And let me spend a word in favor of the World Economic Association, and in particular Maria Alejandra Madi, because indeed it was Maria Alejandra Madi that involved me in that movement, knowing the background, knowing my background, knowing the school I comes from, which is the same as yours, And really in that environment, I found hospitality and a welcoming approach also toward our ideas, and probably is also partially in our environment there is a tendency toward the creation of a certain ghetto, so also not getting engaged with the world outside. And that's why when we created the Center for Market Education, we put as a mission, yes, to promote a better understanding of the driving forces of the market, but also the importance of pluralism in economics education, because it's the attempt and also a remind for me that there is a world beyond Austrian economics, and we need to engage with it.
I think that's extremely important. So History of Economic Society is another group that is very open to this. I've spent a lot of my time, because of the practicalities of academics, I train mainly PhD students to become teachers of economics, as opposed to primarily teaching undergraduate students. So in fact, right now, the only time I teach undergraduate students is in the summer time, and that is to help train a PhD student to be able to teach undergraduate students. So my primary teaching responsibilities are PhD classes. So I'm a teacher of teachers, as opposed to a teacher in some direct sense to undergraduates. And I very much highly value undergraduate education, because I myself was a product of a great teacher of undergraduate education. So I value that. So that means that I care about ideas and then placement of PhD students in leveraged academic jobs, right? And so that means that a lot of my efforts professionally have been directed at trying to build those bridges that you're talking about, but to more, a more mainstream audience as best as I can, And so there's been some real great opportunities because of the general recognition of institutions in economics that's happened over the last 30 years of my career, as opposed to institutions, which was extremely heterodox position back when I was a graduate student. Now it's a much more, Darren Acemoglu is as mainstream as you can get, and that's a major part of his story, right? And so I have spent a lot of time trying to build those bridges, and less time focusing on building the bridges to the history of thought community and the heterodox community that I, in many ways, took for granted I was part of, right? And I regret that to some extent, because the hospitality intellectually, and when I go to HES meetings, I want to go to more sessions than any other meetings that I go to. So if I go to History of Economic Society meetings, I'm not sitting there looking at the program thinking, God, is this going to be like a disaster for me to go to this? I'm like, oh my God, can I go to this one? Can I go to that one? Can I go to this one? I end up by trying to jump between sessions. And I imagine if I went to the World Economic Forum, with the World Economic Association, I would do the same thing, because the topics are what are naturally fascinating to me. And I think it's fantastic that you attended that. And I wish more people that share our interests were represented there. I think Don's work probably would have been more widely understood and appreciated within that community had there been representatives like myself or Dave or Steve Horowitz or Emily Chamley Wright, or now you, that were there from the beginning, to be part of that. So yeah, that's my dog. I don't know if everyone hears my dog barking. She's telling me to shut up. That's right.
So we have a couple of questions on the teaching of history. One is from Professor Anindita from Taylor. So how do you introduce the relationship between economics and history?
Say that again. Sorry.
How would you introduce the relationship between economics and history to undergrads studying history, but also how important is economic history for understanding economics? And just as an introduction, I remember when I was a student in my alma mater in Italy, there was no way that you could start macro or micro without going to economic history first. we had a long 72 hours class in economic history, and that was a prerequisite for macro and micro.
Okay, so let me just, this is going to be somewhat of an abstract and insider baseball answer, and then I'll come back to a more broad one. But in my presentation, I mentioned about spontaneous order being invisible hand explanations. So if you look up the term invisible hand explanations, you could find two references. One of them is going to be Robert Nozick in his book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, has a section on invisible hand explanations. Or you'll find the philosopher Edmund Ullman Margalit, okay, who wrote Edna Ullman Margalit, who wrote a book called Invisible Hand Explanations. What invisible hand explanations are, and by the way, in Nozick's presentation, I think he gives 16 cases, 8 of which are desirable, 8 of which are undesirable. So spontaneous order or invisible hand doesn't necessarily mean socially desirable outcomes. It could generate bad outcomes too. It's a style of reasoning. And that style of reasoning goes as follows. You have an animating agent that then gets placed into an institutional filter. And then that institutional filter working with the animating agent gives us an outcome that we can then see. So the way you translate that into a scientifically operational program is to have the following. You have a preferences as given, right? This is why economists do this, right? And then you have variation in institutions, and that then studies variation in outcomes. So the variation in outcomes are not a function of variation in people. People are people, they're the same. It's a variation of the institutions. Now, how do I understand or get access to variation of institutions? History. That's what the pattern is, right? And so the way that so this is the interaction effect between economic theory and historical circumstances, right? Which will allow us to then understand the actual playing out of history and practice. And so to me, so I wrote an essay many, many years ago about reform of the curriculum. And my reform of the curriculum in economics was twofold. Was that all graduate students need to return to the classic texts, and they all need to write at least one paper where they rely on primary sources in history. So you return to the diaries, you return to the memoirs. Now, of course, this is a hermeneutical approach that you and I share, because we're trying to give intentionality to the agents in the model, and we want to study the meanings that they have. And so you think about it, if economics, the way you and I want to do, is about meanings, not prediction, right? It's about understanding and meanings and understanding, not prediction and control, right? So if the goal of economics is prediction and control, the kind of things that I'm saying are not right. I think economics should shift and be about meaning and understanding. So human meanings, we're trying to understand, our quest is to understand the human condition. It's not to control the condition, right? Or anything like that. And so as a result, economic history is vital to the intellectual exercise of that. But economics is a set of eyeglasses. And I need those eyeglasses to be able to read the book of human history. So rather than teaching history first and then economics, it would be more valuable, I think, though maybe strategically history to excite, then theory, then revisit the history. But the main idea is to see the power in the lenses that we have, that we've given them for reading. And to me, that's what we need to do. But the purpose of theory is to do history. The purpose of theory is not to prove theorems. The purpose of theory is to build a set of eyeglasses that allow us to read out the window better and to read human history better.
Thank you very much. This gives me a chance also to inform our audience that on our website, marketedu.org, we have a series of papers that are available for free that are conceived to be like study materials and introductory material for this kind of approach to economics. So far we have published 2. One is titled Economics, Human Action and Its Meaning. It is probably really an introductory paper to economics as we think it should be conceived. And the second one is on the role of entrepreneurs, titled Entrepreneurs, One, No One, 100,000. So this material is available for free. More are coming on spontaneous order, on the role of history, on subjectivity of revenues and costs, and on the market process as well. So our team of fellows is working on these new papers. Unfortunately,
can I answer?
Yes.
Can I answer a question
Sure,
that was raised in the beginning that I thought was very useful? I saw it and I just want to make sure I answer it, because there was a question that was raised about, I think it might have been the very first one that was raised, about independent educational institutions.
Yes.
And teaching economics and the role of independent educational institutions. And I want to be clear about something with that. I'm 100% in support of independent educational institutions and teaching economics in a variety of different ways. Many, many years ago, I was asked to go to New Zealand, and I gave a tour of lectures throughout New Zealand, from the South Island to North Island, from all over the place. I went and it was fantastic. But one of the things that I learned while I was in New Zealand is that a lot of the intellectual energy at that time was not in the universities, but was in independent educational institutions and, in fact, in government, actually. And it shocked me, because that's not true in the United States, right? And I only know what's true in the United States. When I started my career, I was working on communism and post-communism issues. I traveled a lot throughout all of Eastern Europe and Russia, and went on. Again, the same thing. The universities were not necessarily the hotbed for educational innovation. It was independent institutions. So I'm a huge fan of that. I think it's fantastic that the Mises Institute is developing their program or whatever. And so the Foundation for Economic Education, Center for Market, ideas, that all that stuff is extremely valuable and very important. And I'm 100% in support of it. The question has always been that the world is different in the 20th century than it was in the 19th century. So people point out, so the Mises, as brilliant as he was, never understood 20th century academics the way that Hayek did. And certainly Hayek didn't understand it the way Fritz Machlup did, okay? They thought it was different. So, like John Stuart Mill is one of the greatest thinkers of the 19th century. He wasn't a professor at Oxford or Cambridge, right? And so the issue of how economics was communicated in the 19th century was through books and through letters. They didn't have the learned journals that we have now. There wasn't a professionalization of economic science. That was done by Alfred Marshall, that, you became a professional economist in a certain way, and you had an engagement in economics, and it required a certain level of discourse among those scientists or whatever. And that only got more severe in the 20th century. All right. And so the idea that a Henry Hazlitt, who in the early part of the 20th century was the leading economic journalist in America, and Henry Hazlitt would publish a book and the economics journals would have to review it because it's Henry Hazlitt, right? So we tend to forget this. So you can look up economics in one lesson. It was reviewed in all these different places. You look up his critique of Keynesian economics. It was reviewed in all these different places. All right. But an economic journalist today would not have the attention of the economics profession in a certain way. And if you get a non-accredited degree from some outfit, whether or not it's good, bad, or whatever, it's going to not help you in entering into this professional club. Now, that professional club might have all kinds of problems that we need to challenge and whatnot. That's why you have the World Economic, Association and stuff to challenge it. But it's where the mistake happens is when people think that they can go one route but achieve a goal in another route. And that's where the misinformation comes in. But in terms of being able to actually support all the kinds of activities that needed in education, I am for a ton of these independent organizations. And the more information, the better. The more that people are able to do things online, so they have more options. You know, I think it would be fantastic for them to have those resources. My colleagues, Tyler Cowan and Alex Tabrek through Marginal Revolution University, are doing an amazing job educating the world of economics. And so I'm 100% in support of it. I wish that I was better at doing that, because I really care about communicating economic ideas. But a degree from Marginal Revolution University is not going to get you in the inner circle of the economic science profession to try to change economic science. And a large part of what I care about is changing economic science. So when I make these statements that I'm forced to make sometimes, it's not that I'm denigrating any independent efforts. I want 1,000 flowers to bloom to get economics ideas across, to educate the masses. But what I also want to do is I want to control, or have a say in, control's the wrong word, but I want to have a say in the economic science. And in order to do that, you have to, you know, do things. I don't know what the top sport in Malaysia is, but imagine that in all of the different countries, there's different sports: soccer, football, whatever you call it, baseball, highlight, whatever it might be, cricket. You don't just go from being an amateur to a professional because you were really, really good in the amateur league, right? You have to actually go through a very difficult winnowing out process to be able to be like a great bowler in cricket, right? You don't just like, oh, I was really good in the church league, so now I can be really good, you know, over here in the professionals. And, you know, so those are the kind of questions I think, yeah.
Okay, I think we are running out of time. There are a lot of questions we couldn't answer, but I would like to close, I think, with one question from Namit Mahajan. Is very relevant to the topic of today, and I think could be the right closing tune for this conversation. And the question is, what advice would you have for someone who is about to start their college and majoring in economics?
Oh, that's a great question. I think one is to let their curiosity guide them. You know, I always tell my graduate students that curiosity might kill the cat, but it fuels the scholar. So what I would do is, if I was a young student and entering in, I wouldn't tell them about what books to read or anything like that. I would say, be curious, ask questions. Don't take anything as sacrosanct, right? And sort of, you know, be the kind of, you know, person that's open to dialogue and learning, and be willing to say, I don't know. The beginning of learning is the ability to stare in a mirror and say, I don't know. Let me try to figure that out. And then just find the sheer pleasure in finding things out. I think it would be a mistake to think that economics provides all the answers in the world. But I think it's a mistake to think economics doesn't provide guides that will help me find answers in the world. And I think that's the key thing that we as teachers need to tap into, that we as students have a responsibility to bring that to the table: our curiosity, our ability to read, our desire to wrestle with ideas that challenge us to the core. So whatever your view is, pretend you're the opposite for a minute. And, you know, so you'll understand this because it's a philosophical point, but there's a great philosopher named Daniel Dennett. And for your listeners, they should look this up. It's called Dennett's Rules of Intellectual Engagement. It's a 4-step argument of intellectual engagement. And I think if you read that and internalize it in the way that you engage in your studies, so that you don't try to listen to indict someone, but you listen in order to understand the position and see its presentation in its best form and then try to argue why it's still weak, you'll advance your own knowledge and the knowledge of people around you. I think it's too easy for us to become comfortable with the things that, well, we're comfortable with. And what we should do, especially when we're young, is constantly challenge ourselves. And if we do it when we're young, it becomes intoxicating. So then we can keep doing it when we get older. And that's how you stay young, intellectually and fresh. Ideas out there, and just enjoy the process. But curiosity.
Thank you very much. I think we can close. I really thank you for having accepted our invitation to be our speaker. I would like to thank Ideas for the support, to the Center for Market Education and Taylor University and Professor Neethia for having co-hosted this event with us. Thanks to all the participants and I hope they enjoyed this session. You can take a look at our website, www.marketedu.org, or look for our Twitter account and Facebook page. So we have more initiatives to come. I think the next webinars will be with Maria Leandra Madi on green economics, and we will have also a webinar with Sam Fordicheda on what's a city and urban planning. In the past 2-3 years, I work a lot on the housing market in Malaysia, so is a theme that is dear to me. So thank you very much again.
Let me tell you 2 things. Can I say 2 things real quick? One is that my distinction of the 4 pillars actually comes from Sandy Akita. So you can ask him about that. And then the second thing is that if you're interested in this urban planning stuff, there's a new PhD, Gonzalo Millán, from Spain, who just wrote a whole book on that. His background is he's already an architect. And then he went and did a PhD in economics, and it's fascinating stuff. And so I highly recommend it, in these conversations. But it was a great pleasure for me to do this. I want to thank Taylor University and your groups for giving me this opportunity. And I hope that I was able to communicate some basic ideas to people in a way that they appreciate. So
thank you so much to Professor Boettke. I think it's been a very enlightening and stimulating session. Just by looking at the question and answers and all the queries that we have, I think you've really ignited the real point on how economics and social science can actually emerge together, especially today. And Dr. Carmelo, thank you so much.
Thanks to you
for organizing this. We really hope that we can do more as we go, and I truly would like to invite Dr. Boettke to come to Taylor's one day when traveling is not restricted and the borders are open, are more flexible and all that. We really wish to see you on campus at Taylor's in Malaysia. So you're always welcome.
I would love to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.